This video was brought to you by our Patreon backers, like Hamad Z. Find out more and support the channel by clicking the link below. Over the last few days, you might have seen in the news that the US is having a life expectancy crisis. So in this video, we're going to take a look at why it's so low and why it's been falling. Although you won't be surprised to hear that life expectancy has fallen significantly since COVID, a recent article in the BMJ found that US life expectancy fell by 1.87 years from 2018 to 2020, which is 8.5 times as much as the average in other developed countries. This alone is a pretty scary statistic, but it's made worse by the fact that US life expectancy was already below international averages in 2018. The average life expectancy in the US in 2018 was 78.7 years, whereas the average across 16 developed countries was 81.8. In 2020, after 9 months of COVID, life expectancy in the US had fallen to 76.9, whereas the average life expectancy in these developed countries had only fallen to 81.6. So why is this? Well, in part it's because the US had one of the worst COVID death rates, but it's also because, pre-2018, US life expectancy was already trending downwards, while life expectancy in other countries was increasing. From 2014 to 2018, life expectancy in the US fell by 0.2 years, whereas life expectancy in these 16 developed nations rose by an average of 0.6 years. This is in spite of the fact that the US has been spending more per capita on healthcare than, well, basically any other developed country. So, what's going on? Why is the life expectancy in the US so low, despite the fact the US spends so much on healthcare? And why did life expectancy actually fall from 2014 to 2018? Well, let's start with the first question. The first thing worth saying is that while the US spends a lot on healthcare, that's at least in part because the very wealthiest in the US spend an absolute ton on private healthcare. And the first graph we showed you includes both public and private expenditure. According to data from 2009, the top 1% of healthcare spenders account for more than 20% of all private healthcare expenditure, which is driving some of the disparity between US health spending and life expectancy. Nonetheless, even when you ignore private spending and just look at public spending on Medicare, Medicaid, and Obamacare, the US still isn't getting bang for its buck. The US federal government spends about 8% of GDP on healthcare, roughly the same as other developed nations, but still has a notably lower life expectancy. This is despite the fact that about 10% of the US population are still not covered by a federal healthcare plan. And it's not like the federal government is fully covering healthcare costs anyway. Essentially, no matter how you spin the stats, it's undeniable that US life expectancy is way below what it ought to be. So why is this? We're going to talk about 3 specific reasons. The US's relatively high number of fatal road accidents, homicides, and drug-related deaths. The US has about 12 fatal road accidents per 100,000 people per year, far more than other developed nations. And that's in part because the legal driving age in certain states is as low as 14. The US also has a far higher homicide rate than many countries, thanks in part to the rather relaxed gun laws in the country. And the nation has far more drug-related deaths than any other developed country, with only Scotland coming close. However, the fundamental reason that US life expectancy is so low is probably due to inequality. To understand this, you need to know about the Preston curve. The Preston curve, first described by Samuel Preston in 1975, describes the relationship between life expectancy and income. Essentially, increases in income have diminishing returns on life expectancy. This means that within societies there will be an inverse relationship between income inequality and life expectancy. To illustrate this, consider the relationship between fertilizer and crop yields. Fertilizer gives diminishing returns on crop yields, so the first bit of fertilizer makes a massive difference. The second bit a bit less difference, the third even less so. Now imagine I have 5 fields of crops and 5 containers of fertilizer. The maximum crop yield will be achieved by spreading the fertilizer out evenly, because then each bit of fertilizer will be having the maximum impact on crop yields. An unequal distribution would mean doubling the fertilizer in one field, rather than putting any in another. Because of diminishing returns on crop yield, this would result in a lower total yield. The same thing goes for people. The less equally income is distributed, the lower total and therefore average life expectancy will be. And, well, the US has worse income inequality than almost all other developed countries. To demonstrate this, we're going to look at the Gini coefficient, a popular measure of income inequality that runs from 0 to 1. 0 describes a country where everyone has equal income, and 1 describes a country where only one person has income and everyone else has nothing. According to the 2017 OECD data, the US has a Gini coefficient of 0.434, which is higher than any other developed country. Things don't get much better when you look at wealth instead of income, and it's plausible to assume that there's a similar relationship between income and wealth with life expectancy. According to a 2014 Allianz report, the US has the highest levels of wealth inequality anywhere in the world. Anyway, you get the point. It's at least plausible that the US's low life expectancy is partly due to its high levels of inequality. Now, it's also very likely that it could have something to do with how the US's healthcare system is set up, but that would require a whole nother video entirely, so we'll put that aside for a moment. All of this hopefully goes some way to answering the question, why is the US's life expectancy so low? But it doesn't explain the second question. Why did US life expectancy actually fall from 2014 to 2018? Well, this decline was mostly driven by a fall in life expectancy for mostly middle-aged, poorer white Americans without a college degree. In a now famous paper that spawned a book, Death and Despair, two academics, Anne Case and Angus Deaton, described how an increase in drug overdoses, suicides, and alcohol-related mortality have driven this collapse in life expectancy. As we mentioned earlier in the video, the US suffers more drug-related deaths than other countries, but what we didn't show is how this has changed over time, with the US seeing a terrifying explosion in opioid overdoses since about 2000, partly driven by the overprescription of opioid analgesics such as OxyContin. And it's worth noting here that it's mostly big pharmaceutical companies that stand to gain from this overprescription. For example, Purdue Pharmaceutical earned over $31 billion from sales of OxyContin, before eventually closing down after admitting to encouraging doctors to prescribe OxyContin without a legitimate medical reason. Something similar is true for suicides. Suicide rates in the US have risen for both college and non-college educated whites, but have risen faster for the latter. And finally, when you look at alcohol-related mortality, while college-educated whites actually drink more often than their non-college educated equivalents, the latter are more likely to binge drink, and are binge drinking harder than ever. This has translated into increased alcohol-related mortality for non-college educated whites. When you combine these three deaths of despair, opioid overdose, suicide, and alcohol-related mortality, you get a graph that looks like this for middle-aged white Americans. As you can see, and as you might expect, in other countries, fewer and fewer people are dying deaths of despair. Among middle-aged white Americans, however, the opposite is true. When you delve a little deeper into the data, you realise that it's specifically non-college educated white Americans. This increase in deaths of despair is so drastic that it's actually pushed up all-cause mortality amongst middle-aged white Americans. In fact, non-college educated whites today have higher all-cause mortality at every age than their black counterparts, a complete reversal from 20 years ago. Essentially, a partial answer to that second question, why is US life expectancy actually falling, is that non-college educated white Americans are dying earlier and earlier, largely due to so-called deaths of despair. This is slightly terrifying and frankly rather underappreciated, because it bucks a trend that basically persisted throughout all modern history. As time goes on and nations get richer, life expectancy should go up. Anyway, that's the US life expectancy crisis, and hopefully we've gone some way to explaining why the US's life expectancy is so low, and why it's actually been falling recently. Let us know your thoughts on the crisis, and what the US ought to do in the comments below. As I said at the start, videos like this are made possible by our Patreon backers. In return for their support, they get a whole variety of perks, such as early access to videos, exclusive live events, merch discounts, and more. Find out what you can get and sign up by clicking the link in the description.